We left off last episode on the 20th of March 1861, when William Tamihana told all the warriors to go home, and the colonial generals decided there was no point in taking undefended land. The war had ended, but peace hadn't yet been made. William Kingi and Donald Maclean were the two people on the ground who were able to start negotiating peace. They met on the 21st and agreed that there would be a ceasefire until the governor arrived, that Te Atiawa could visit their fields, orchards and graves, and that William Kingi would remain nearby so that he would be ready when the governor arrived. Gore Brown was the only person who could agree to peace on behalf of the government, and he arrived on the 27th of March along with a small but powerful group, including Frederick Whitaker, the Attorney General, Francis Weld, the Native Affairs Minister, Tamati Napora, a representative of the Kingitanga, and Tamate Wakanene, the Ngāpuhi chief. So this was a good start, but things soon got a bit farcical. Over the next few days, the Maori chiefs were used as emissaries, going back and forth and taking place in a large number of inconclusive discussions. General Pratt took this opportunity to leave. He had been effectively replaced by Lieutenant General Duncan Cameron. The British government had separated Australia and New Zealand into distinct military commands, and Pratt was left in command of the Australian forces. However, he seems to have been okay with this and chose not to remain awaiting Cameron's arrival. I can't be certain, but a few sources say that Pratt had grown disillusioned with the war and had come to the conclusion that Kingi's cause was just and Pratt was leading the bad guys. Whatever the reason, he left the country as soon as he could. On the 2nd of April, Kingi reached out to the governor. He was happy with the peace as agreed on the 21st, and would be happy to formalise it if the governor came to visit him, after which Kingi would visit the military camp and agree to the terms. However, Gore Brown was advised it would be a humiliation to visit Kingi first, so instead proposed that Kingi visit him at the military camp first. Haparona came to visit the governor, but Kingi did not. The next day, and the day after as well, Haparona and Kingi's daughter visited the governor, but Kingi did not. Haparona was happy with the status quo, although he wanted the soldiers to withdraw to New Plymouth. On the 5th, Robert Parris went to Kingi, but the governor did not, and on the 6th, Haparona and Rewi Maniapoto visited the governor, but Kingi did not. However, on the 6th, Haparona delivered a letter from Kingi. "It is well. Let the law of God protect us both. No more. I am going to Mangere. There we will see one another." However, Kingi did not leave, and Gore Brown wrote a letter to Kingi putting forward his terms for peace. They are as follows. Number 1. The investigation of the Title II and the survey of the land at Waitara to be continued and completed without interruption. Number 2. Every man to be permitted to state his claim without interference, and my decision, or the decision of such persons as I shall appoint, to be conclusive. Number 3. All the land in possession of Her Majesty's forces belonging to those who have borne arms against Her Majesty to be disposed of by me as I may think fit. Number 4. All arms belonging to the government to be returned. Number 5. All plunder taken from the settlers to be forthwith restored. Number 6. The Ngāti Awa who have borne arms against the government must submit to the Queen and to the authority of the law, and not resort to force for the redress of grievances real or imaginary. Gore Brown also included a promise that although he would confiscate all the land occupied by soldiers, he would return almost all of it to its owners, excepting the redoubts, some land around it, and land for roads. On the 8th, Haparona came to visit the governor, without Kingi of course. Haparona agreed to the terms and agreed to work towards peace. However, Kingi took a different approach. He wrote a letter saying he consented to peace, but would not agree to the terms given. Instead, he was going to the Waikato. Rewi Maniapoto is credited with Kingi's decision to move to Waikato. Rewi had stayed behind when William Tamihana left, apparently concerned that Kingi would agree to an unfair peace without Waikato support. Rewi decided to convince Kingi to come live with him at Kihikihi, to prevent him from agreeing to the terms in a moment of weakness. For the next few years, Kingi would be a guest of Ngāti Maniapoto, and Rewi would keep a close eye on him. Historians disagree on whether Kingi was more of a guest or a prisoner of Ngāti Maniapoto, but the important thing is he did not agree to the governor's peace. Gore Brown didn't think this was particularly important though. He expected that Kingi would sink into complete insignificance if left alone. Instead, he sent a letter to Taranaki and Ngāti Rauanui offering them terms for peace. However much I may condemn the offences committed by the Ngāti Awa, I look on those perpetrated by you to be of far more serious nature, and before I can consent to grant you peace, I shall require restitution and compensation for the past, and explicit declaration of your intention to conduct yourselves as peaceable and orderly subjects of Her Majesty for the future. I require 1. Entire submission to the Queen and the law. 2. All plunder now in your possession to be forthwith given up, and compensation made for that which is not returned, and for property destroyed and injured. 3. That all mail shall be permitted to pass without interruption, and the mail carriers protected. 4. That people, goods, and cattle shall be allowed to pass without molestation. The grave offence of killing unarmed settlers and children is one against the Queen and the law, and will not be overlooked. Whenever those men who are charged with having committed that offence are taken by the officers of justice, they will be tried, and the law will declare whether they are guilty, and if guilty, what punishment they shall suffer. Those iwi did not formally respond to this list of demands. Taranaki needed to consult at a series of hui, while Ngāti Rauanui didn't even bother with discussions. Their response was to stop the mail travelling through their lands. The Tairumaka continued to be occupied, and no one received compensation for the destroyed property. The King movement was the final major combatant that Gore Brown needed to attempt peace with, and probably the most important. But he took his time sending demands to the Kingitanga, only writing his demands to them on the 21st of May. However, the political situation in the Waikato was changing over those weeks that he delayed. When Tamihana had led the Waikato and Ngāti Maniapoto warriors home, they were not happy with this course of action. In fact, as soon as they reached Mokau, and were therefore on their own land and not Te Atiawa's, Tamihana was almost lynched by his own people. Tamihana eventually managed to talk them into sparing his life, but he did leave the warriors and carry on by himself. Over the next few weeks he went on a tour of the villages and pa of the Waikato to explain his actions and listen to the thoughts of the people. Over the course of this tour, his attitude seems to have hardened. He was still a pacifist and desired peace, but there were very few concessions that he was willing to accept in order to get peace. This seems to have been the common attitude of the Kingitanga. They wanted peace with the government, but they were not willing to submit to any unreasonable requests from the governor. While Tamihana was doing his listening tour, the governor and government were busy planning for the future. There was a consensus amongst the Pākehā leadership that the current arrangement of Maori governance was unacceptable to the future of the colony. Maori would have to be civilised and brought under English laws. There were two main thrusts to this desire. Firstly, governance, and secondly, military. In terms of governance, it will be recalled that iwi and hapu differed in their approach, but as a general rule in the 1850s and 60s, these groups were governed by runanga where people spoke on an issue until consensus was reached. These councils did not have power to enforce their decisions, other than the moral authority of the people who participated in the runanga. What the governor proposed in a long letter he sent to the Colonial Secretary for approval on the 26th of May was that these runanga be formalised, with one runanga having legislative authority over a defined area, with one person appointed to act as a communication channel for the government. These runanga would elect native assessors, subject to the governor's approval, to administer justice in the district with the support of a Pākehā official. Communal land ownership was incompatible with English law, so he proposed to increase the salary of the native assessors and have them sit on a court with a Pākehā land commissioner to determine the individual ownership of Maori land and therefore bring English property rights to the Maori people, including of course the right to sell land. He also wanted to establish schools for Maori teaching, agriculture in particular, and build roads over Maori land, particularly for military purposes in the Waikato, Taranaki and Whanganui districts. It should be noted that if this plan was implemented, it would have severely reduced Maori autonomy and power in New Zealand. Although not stated explicitly, it seems the intention was to make every hapu independent and to set institutional boundaries between them, making it difficult for Maori to combine to oppose settlers. Likewise, individual land title was intended to have the same effect. In terms of actual powers of enforcement, the assessors and land courts would be funded by the government, not the runanga, and would have direct Pākehā involvement, not to mention that all the assessors and the land courts would all have to be approved by the governor. All of this means that justice in these districts was quite likely to favour the Pākehā government over the Māori runanga. However, due to the communication delay between New Zealand and Britain, it would be some time before this plan was approved or otherwise by the Imperial government. This communication delay would also have an impact on the other area of activity over those few weeks, the military aspect of the governor's plans. Lieutenant General Cameron was ordered to New Zealand to fight a war, but had arrived a few days after peace had been made, or at least a ceasefire. However, everyone seems to have been telling him that a future war was necessary and would happen sooner rather than later. Donald Maclean wrote that Ngāti Rauanui required further chastisement since they had not agreed to peace. Thomas Smith wrote that it is not improbable that the Maori King Party in the Waikato may interpose between the government and the men who have been in arms against the Queen's authority, as to prevent the acceptance by the latter of such terms as may be offered, in which case no alternative would remain but the employment of military force to compel submission. On the 30th of March, before the peace negotiations had even begun, the Taranaki Herald wrote an editorial that repeatedly spoke of future conflict with Ngāti Rauanui and the Kingitanga. We shall then be face to face with the King movement in its nakedness, and whether the rumours of the week be true or not, that the Waikatos retired with threats on their lips and quite unbroken, there can be for the future but one watchword: order and the Queen. ... Prudence, justice and convenience point to Ngāti Rauanui and Taranaki for marked examples, and their territories as the chief source of reparation for our losses. The pretense of the kingship meant to interfere on behalf of other tribes will probably bring us again into collision there, and in any case we may be confident that the liberal support of the mother country will not be wasted, but on all sides ample security for future peace and indemnity for past injuries will be taken. The general thrust of this article was that while Te Ātiawa may have been defeated, there could only be a temporary peace until the other combatants were broken and punished for their actions over the previous year. Over the next few weeks the newspaper continued this line, suspecting that the peace with Te Ātiawa was a hoax, and arguing that it was better not to give their enemies time to recover. Gore Brown himself had said something similar to some New Plymouth citizens. He had sent messages to Taranaki and Ngāti Rauanui saying he had heard they wanted peace, and if so they must ask for it, and they should be told on what terms it could be had. No great time for negotiation would be allowed, and if the terms were not quickly accepted, he should put the affair in Major General Cameron's hands and ask him to do his best. So from the government side, it seemed that they were not keen to work towards a peaceful compromise. Maori would submit to their authority, or the fighting would soon start. In practice, soon meant in the spring. Cameron didn't want to fight a war in the winter, which meant that August or September was the practical deadline for Maori submission. Cameron set about preparing for this likely conflict, but was not happy with the forces at his disposal. If he was ordered to invade the Waikato, he informed Gore Brown that he would need a striking force of at least 3,000 Imperial soldiers. These soldiers would need a supply line running back to Auckland, and this supply line would also need Imperial soldiers to defend it. However, there were only 6,000 Imperial soldiers under his command, meaning that an invasion of the Waikato would require the bulk of the professional forces in New Zealand, and the Pākehā settlements would have to be defended by the local militia. But outside of Taranaki, the militia was of very poor quality, and the Imperial military officers tend to rate the Taranaki militia as poor. The Taranaki militia had a mix of modern and Napoleonic firearms, and had weekly target practice, and some of them had fought at Waireka or in skirmishes. But outside of Taranaki, the militia didn't have modern weapons. In fact, they often did not have weapons at all, and target practice had not happened. The Auckland militia had been called out briefly in response to Tāwhio coming north to investigate the murder of Epiha, but it is doubtful whether they could have prevented aggressive actions from the Kingitanga. Cameron wanted more soldiers from the Imperial government and better trained militia that was able to operate further from their homes. However, the colonial government disagreed, at least in part. They were keen for more professional soldiers, but didn't want the expense of creating a decent militia. Edward Stafford, the Premier, wrote a memorandum on this topic. The Militia Act of 1860 prescribes that a militia district shall not exceed 30 miles in diameter, and no militia force can be taken for service out of its district. This, at first sight, may appear an undue limitation, but it must not be overlooked that such a militia as that of New Zealand is not available for offensive operations. Its utility and strength is for defence. It could, under any circumstances, be only used to a limited extent as an invading force, and if so used it would be very costly, as not only would the men require sufficient pay to provide themselves with food and clothing, but most of their families would have to be maintained at the public expense, while all industrial employment will be put to an end, and those who now yield the public a revenue, instead of being a contributor to, would become dependent on the public funds. While, therefore, every consideration points to the policy of employing the colonial forces for offensive operations, there is no doubt that for defensive purposes it may be made very effective. The Duke of Newcastle, Secretary for State for Colonies, responded to these proposals in the negative. I perceive from these dispatches that the colonial government propose, as their share of the expense of the Maori War, to maintain, under the Militia Acts, such part of the colonial forces as may be necessary for the defence of the several settlements, leaving the rest of the expense to be defrayed by the Imperial Government, and requiring that part of the cost which is to fall on themselves be, in the first instance, advanced from the commissariat chest. I think it is necessary to inform you at once that I am by no means satisfied with these proposals, though I refrain from entering into any detailed examination of them until I receive some report from yourself upon the subject. I take this opportunity of informing you that I have been unable to advise that Sir G. Lewis should accede to General Cameron's request for more troops. It is my opinion that the Imperial Government has done enough by sending out 6,000 men, and that the colony can and ought to do the rest. In other words, if another war was going to happen in New Zealand, the Imperial Government was not inclined to send any more soldiers or money. They expected that the New Zealand Government either work to maintain peace, or pay for the war if they couldn't. However, the communication time between Auckland and London meant that London really didn't have a say in these matters. The Imperial Government didn't write this response until September, and it would take a few months before it reached New Zealand, well after the time for the proposed invasion of the Waikato. But of course, before the government got around to invading the Waikato, they had to present the King movement with their demands for peace. This came in late May, when Gore Brown gave a lengthy letter to the Kingitanga. This letter is much longer than those to Te Atiawa and Taranaki and Ngāti Rauanui, so bear with me. The governor can now only look with sorrow and displeasure on what has been done in the name, and by the adherents of, the native king. 1. An authority has been set up inconsistent with allegiance to the Queen and in violation of the Treaty of Waitangi. 2. A large number of adherents of the native king have interfered between the governor and other native tribes in matters with which they have no concern, have levied war against the Queen, fought against her troops, and burnt and destroyed the property of her peaceful subjects. 3. Other adherents of the king have assisted, encouraged, and harboured the men who have committed these outrages. 4. A war party of several hundred men, some time since assembled, and advanced to within 40 miles of Auckland, for the purpose of interfering with the due course of the administration of justice. 5. Her Majesty's mail has been stopped, jurisdiction has been usurped over Her Majesty's European subjects, and other offences have been committed to the subversion of Her Majesty's sovereignty and of the authority of law. At this very time, the adherents of the native king are using the most strenuous efforts to possess themselves of arms and ammunition, for the purpose of effecting their objects by intimidation and violence. The governor cannot permit this present state of things to continue. No option now rests with him. He has been commanded by Her Majesty the Queen to suppress unlawful combinations and to maintain Her Majesty's sovereignty in New Zealand. Submission to Her Majesty's sovereignty requires 1. That every man yield implicit obedience to what the law, which is the same for all, prescribes for the public welfare. But while the law exacts what is essential for this object, it confers great benefits and guarantees freedom and security to the weak as well as to the strong. 2. That rights be sought and protected through the law, and not by a man's own will and strength. No man in the Queen's dominions is permitted to enforce rights or redress wrongs by force. He must appeal to the law. 3. That men do not enter into combinations for the purpose of preventing other men from acting, or from dealing with their own property as they think fit. This is against the law. 4. That every man, European or native, under the Queen's sovereignty, submit to have roads and bridges made on his land, wherever the public convenience requires them, but land can only be taken for these purposes under lawful authority and on payment of reasonable compensation. ... The Governor now states specifically what his demands are. 1. From all, submission without reserve to the Queen's sovereignty and the authority of the law. 2. From those who are in possession of plunder taken from Her Majesty's European or native subjects, restoration of that plunder. 3. From those who have destroyed or made away with property belonging to Her Majesty's subjects, European or native, compensation for the losses sustained. Compliance with these demands will satisfy the Queen and her Governor. No other demand will be made on Waikato. The past will be forgiven, and for the future the well-conducted will be protected, offenders punished, and the rights and privileges of all maintained by the Queen and her laws. This list of demands was delivered to the Runanga at Ngaruawahia via Tamati Napora. He had been given his copy by Thomas Smith, an Auckland Land Commissioner, and Smith left an account of the very long discussion that the two men had. Smith said that they went through the whole thing line by line to make sure that the Governor's message was clear and discussed a number of key points in depth. Napora was non-committal, but agreed to take the message down to Ngaruawahia. This runanga was surprisingly brief considering the importance of the discussion. People began arriving on Monday the 6th of June. 2,500 people would attend according to the Daily Southern Cross correspondence. The 7th was dominated by a tangi for Wetini, who had died at Mahuitahi, and public discussion only really got started on Wednesday, and by Friday the runanga had dispersed. There were a number of Pākehā urging the King movement to take their time to consider the response carefully. Reverend Burrows urged them to consider the Governor's proposals and dwelt upon the fact that the Governor has the Queen's positive commands to suppress by force resistance to her lawful authority. While the Reverend Reed said, if the gospel has made tribes one who were formerly divided, why should the Maoris now seek to separate themselves from the Pākehā who had brought this gospel? The Reverend gentleman then pointed out the discourtesy and even wickedness of their having refused to read the Governor's letter, and showed that letter renewed the guarantee of security for their lands and offered them the opportunity of self-government under proper laws. The Reverend Reed was right. The letter had not been read to the runanga in full. Instead, a few key passages were read out, and then the meeting unanimously decided not to bother with the rest. From the Maori side, the opposition to these demands was near unanimous. E Piha Tokuhihi, who had led the first Ngāti Maniopoto contingent to Taranaki, pointed out in response to the Reverend that God had instructed the Israelites to choose a king from amongst themselves, while others pointed out the reasons why the king movement had been necessary. But the leading speaker in opposition was Wiremu Tamihana. How, he asked, could the Governor demand that the Ngāti Rurunui murderers should be given up when he had taken a murderer, Ihaya, into his alliance? How could the Governor require them to restore plunder when his soldiers had first set the example of destroying property? They had taken 100 horses and 200 cows belonging to William King at Taranaki, and they had burned a chapel and a box of testaments. As to the King flag, he asked, what had the flag done? If it had been employed to initiate any movement against the rightful authority of the Queen, the Governor might have required that the flag should be given up, but not whilst it stood on the Maori land alone. It was also Wiremu Tamihana that took the lead in a written response to the Governor. He wrote a long response while the runanga itself decided on a shorter response. They did not address the specific demands of the Governor, but focused instead on the Governor's transparent intention, that this was to provide a justification for war. This is our intention. We are not going to rise up to fight. Rather will we wait until the eyes have seen, the ears heard, and understanding has entered into the heart. Then shall we see what is the good of fighting, and whether there be a just cause for the chastisement inflicted on evil men. That is upon us Maoris. But now, O friend, restrain your angry feelings against all parts of New Zealand. Let our warfare be that of the lips alone. If such be the course pursued by us, it will be a long path. Our days will be many while engaged in fighting that battle. Let it not be transferred to the battle fought with hands. That is a bad road, a short path. Our days will not be many while engaged with the edge of the sword. But do you, the firstborn of God's sons, consider these things. Let not you and me be committed to the short path. Let us take the circuitous one. Though circuitous, its windings are upon firm land. So while the Runanga recognised there was a conflict and wanted to resolve it through talk, Tamihana's response instead outright rejected the governor's demands. He started with a song, which he helpfully explained the meaning of. Our song refers to those who are double-hearted, whose lips are given to this side and the heart to the other. So the insinuation there is not a great start to a diplomatic letter, but seemingly Tamihana was not inclined to be diplomatic. Now when I worship God I am not rebuked. This great name of God which is spoken of to me, why is this free to me? Well, of this name of king it is said, it is not right. It is a sacred thing. Enough, O friends, it is founded only upon the relation subsisting between the master and his slave. Although the word of the slave may be right, the chief will not admit it to be right. This is it, O friends. Look you at Deuteronomy, chapter 17, verse 15. If all the kings of the different islands were from Rome only, from thence also might come one for here. But is not the Queen a native of England, Nicholas of Russia, Bonaparte of France, Pommery of Tahiti, each from his own people? Then why am I or these tribes rebuked by you and told that we and you must unite together under the Queen? How was it that the Americans were permitted to separate themselves? Why are they not brought under the protecting shade of the Queen? For that people are of the same race as the English, whereas I, of this island, am of a different race, not nearly connected. My only connection with you is through Christ. ... Is it on account of the Treaty of Waitangi that you are angry with us? Was it then that we were taken possession of by you? If so, it is wrong. Look, there are 2 stores of goods. The goods in one store are sold, those of the other are not sold. Now, do you consider that because the goods of one store are sold, that the goods of the other all went also? I say that they did not go. So, with the consent of one chief, that which belonged to another did not go by such consent being given. ... At the commencement of the war at Taranaki, I meditated upon the haste of the governor to be angry. There was no delay, no time given. He did not say to the Maoris, "Friends, I intend to fight at Taranaki." No, there was nothing said, not a word. That was my thoughts dwelt upon what is said in Peter, chapter 2, verse 14. I thought he would have remembered the words, to praise those that do well, and condemn those that do evil. ... Friends, wherein is our friend the governor right, whom you believe in? Te Rangatake, the man of calm thought, is misjudged by you, and the governor, who hasted to anger, is supported and praised by you. Hence my thoughts are perplexed in my heart, for hasty wrath has been condemned by James, who has said, "Be slow to wrath, swift to hear." ... These were the grounds for Waikato's going, the bringing back of William King by Potato, out of friendship to Willimu. In the second place, because of their relations, Rawakitua, Tautara and Natata. The third, they were written for. The fourth, Potato's word that land selling should be made to cease. These were all the grounds of Waikato's interference. If the governor had considered carefully, Waikato would also have considered carefully. But the governor acted foolishly, and that was why the Waikatos went to help Wilimukingi. ... About the word relative to the murdering, my opinion is decidedly that it was not murder. Look, Ihaya murdered Te Whaitiri. He caused him to drink spirits, that the senses of Te Whaitiri might leave him. He was waylaid and died by Ihaya. That was a foul murder. You looked on and made friends with Ihaya. That which we regard as murder you have made naught of, and this which is not a murder you call one? This I think is wrong. For the governor did not say to Wilimukingi and the Ngāti Ruanui, "O friends, do not kill those who are unarmed," nor did he direct that the settlers living in the towns should be removed to Auckland, where there was no fighting, and there stay. For he knew that he had determined to make war at Taranaki, and he should, therefore, have told his unarmed people to remove out of the way. He did not do this. Had he even said to Ngāti Ruanui, "Friends, do not kill the settlers," it would, to some extent, have been a little clearer. Enough on the subject of the murders. This portion is about the property. With reference to the property of which you say that we are to restore what remains, that also I do not consider right. Hearken to what I propose with respect to that. The governor was the cause of that. War was made on Wiramukingi, and he fled from his pa. The pa was burnt with fire, the place of worship was burnt, and a box containing testaments, all was consumed in the fire. Goods, clothes, blankets, shirts, trousers, gowns, all were consumed. The cattle were eaten by the soldiers, and the horses, 100 in number, were sold by auction by the soldiers. It was this that disquieted the heart of Wiramukingi, his church being burnt with fire. Had the governor given word not to burn his church and to leave his goods and animals alone, he would have thought also to spare the property of the Pākehās. This was the cause of the Pākehās' property being lost. When Wiramukingi was reduced to nakedness through the work of the governor, he said that the governor was the cause of all these doings. He first commenced that road, and he merely followed upon it. So that was a long quote, but I think it is important to recognise that the Kingitanga felt that they had not done any wrong in supporting Te Ātiawa. The governor had unjustly started the war, and everything that happened was a response to the government's actions in occupying the Waitara block, firing on Te Kohia Pā, and allowing Te Manukau to burn Kingi's pā at Waitara in the opening days of the war. For the Kingitanga, it was important that the peace couldn't be one-sided. They were not going to make amends for anything they had done and begin a process of reconciliation until the government acknowledged the wrong they had done. Both messages called for talk, the circuitous path of the Runanga, while Tamihana ended by a promise to write more once he received a reply from the governor. However, there wasn't going to be any more talk. At the same time the Runanga was meeting at Ngaruawahia, Parliament was opening in Auckland. The Parliament opened on the 4th of June, but the first few days of the session weren't particularly riveting. The only thing of note is the MP for the suburbs of Nelson resigning on his second day in the job. The next week a committee was formed that would examine the defence requirements of the Pākehā settlements given the changing situation, but it would be a while before this would report back. But that week William Fox started raising concerns about the conduct of the government in the war. He put forward motions for more documents to be made public around the investigations into the ownership of Waitara, including Robert Parris's diary and the letters of clergy who were familiar with the people involved. He asked for returns of all the land purchased by the government and the amount paid, and he wanted figures on the expense of the war, both in its impact on the government's treasury and of settler property and the lives lost on both sides, explicitly so that this could be compared to the value of the land gained as a result of the agreement with Haparona. Stafford, the colonial secretary, emphasised that Parliament couldn't order private records to be presented, and that financial returns would be imperfect, but the government would try to present these records. Fitzherbert joined in, requesting the government to provide more records, including correspondence around the resignation of Donald Maclean. Donald Maclean had dominated the relationship between government and Maori over the past 15 years, and had resigned shortly after the end of the conflict in Taranaki, without giving a public reason, and there was suspicion it was guilt over his role in starting the war. However, he had also had a bad illness the previous year, and might have wanted to have a chance to recover. A further revelation was dropped by Isaac Featherston and Frederick Weld, when they produced a letter written by Robert Parris to the Bishop Selwyn, dated August 1868, which included the following sentence fragment. Lest I should be charged with partiality for natives of that denomination, as some are wont to do, because I refuse to support or countenance dishonourable and treacherous treatment of William King and his people, to exterminate them from the Waitara, in accordance with Mr. Turton's peremptory plan, for the acquirement of that delightful and much-coveted district. The Mr. Turton in question was employed in the Native Department in various roles, and although it doesn't specify what his plan is, it clearly shows that Parris was aware that people in the government were thinking of defrauding Te Ātiawa of the Waitara 8 months before Te Manukau offered to sell it. However, Weld, who had read out that letter, read others where Parris later downplayed his statement, saying that he was referring to the attacks against him in the press and not any plan from anyone in the government. Weld therefore concluded that there was no conspiracy in any part of the government. Featherston wanted more correspondence between the two for extra context and for Parris to be questioned by Parliament. While Fox and Fitzherbert both attacked the government, after 2 days of debate Featherston's motion was agreed to on the 17th of June. However, 2 days earlier the government had received the letters from Ngaruawahia, and attention shifted to a response. The government did not release them to Parliament immediately, claiming that the letters needed to be carefully translated before being released. But on the 18th, the Daily Southern Cross clearly had some understanding of the letters, writing, "The answer to His Excellency's address to Waikato was received on Saturday evening. It proves to be a most voluminous document full of wise laws and modern incidents, but decidedly rebellious, and submission can no longer be looked for even by the most sanguine. Forbearance, patience, and clemency have been tried, and in vain." However, that was the conservative Auckland paper. The next day, the more liberal New Zealander published a more moderate response, along with a full translation of both letters. The plea for delay and for time is strongly urged, and will not, we are sure, be lightly rejected. There is a small but influential party earnestly at work in Waikato, who are not without hopes that this mahi tamariki will in no long time be ended, and that, anger being quenched, the Maoris may voluntarily return to peaceful obedience to the Queen and the law. However, while the newspapers had a full translation, Parliament was still waiting to discuss the letters. But while waiting, William Taylor, a first-term Wellington MP, requested that the government release a letter that the Governor of New South Wales had sent to both Gore Brown and the Duke of Newcastle in London the previous year. Premier Stafford objected to do so. This letter was private correspondence between the Governors of New South Wales and New Zealand, and was therefore not suitable for publication. Fitzherbert pointed out that the letter had already been presented to Parliament in London, and therefore already public. C. W. Richmond, the Treasurer's brother, said that there was no point since the Governor of New South Wales wouldn't have any insight into New Zealand issues anyway. Stafford again spoke, this time taking a different tack. The Governor would like to publish this letter and all other correspondence between the two men, but needed the consent of the Governor of New South Wales. The motion failed, and this letter remained secret in New Zealand, probably because it included statements like, "The fact is that Mr. Richmond's letter is based on the assumption that New Zealand is a colony of white people, with whom unluckily there happens to be mixed up a portion of the native race strong enough to make itself respected. His policy and that of his colleagues would lead to steps which, if they were backed up by England, would in short time annihilate the Maori race, and permit the occupation by the white man of the rich land yet in native hands, upon which for years past greedy and longing eyes have been cast. My view, however, of the Maori is different. He is the subject of the Queen, and as such is entitled to have his rights respected, his feelings considered. He has shown an aptitude for civilization which ought to be encouraged. His efforts to raise himself in the social scale should be assisted. If this policy were carried out steadily and consistently, all causes of disaffection would soon be done away with." But the government decided to take a different approach to the problem. The native minister, Frederick Weld, proposed a motion. 1. That the establishment within these islands of a sovereign authority independent of the British Crown is incompatible with the security of the colonists, the civilization of the natives, and the welfare of both races. 2. That it is the duty of the colony to cordially second the measures taken by the Imperial Government for the assertion of Her Majesty's sovereignty, and for securing a lasting peace. 3. That, if, unhappily, negotiations should fail, this House, relying on the best practicable provision being made for the protection of life and property, does not shrink from the consequences of a resort to force. In other words, the government was seeking Parliament's approval for a return to warfare, this time targeted at the kingitanga. Weld spoke in support of the motion, and then without debate the House moved to a vote on the first clause of the motion. The Speaker only heard one person say no, so the vote passed, although a few people interjected to say that the Speaker had failed to hear them. Attention then turned to the second clause, and Josiah Firth, an Auckland MP, was concerned that this would open up Parliament having to pay for the war. He proposed merging the second and third clauses and reordering it to remove the phrase, "does not shrink from the consequences of a resort to force." With Parliament now giving itself permission to shrink from the consequences of a war it was condoning, the motion was easily passed. So Parliament had endorsed the government's plan to start another war against the King movement. However, this was not enough for Governor Gore Brown. The next week he sent a message directly to Parliament, asking them to clarify their statement. Some uncertainty appears to exist as to the real meaning of these resolutions, and the Governor trusts that the House will agree with him that a distinct understanding on the subject referred to is essential to the interests of both the Imperial and the Colonial Government. He is most anxious that a lasting peace should be secured by negotiation rather than by force of arms, and he desires that negotiations should be continued as long as he feels there is a reasonable hope of a favourable issue. He wishes the House, however, to observe that a portion of the troops now in the colony have been sent to meet an emergency and not to act as a garrison, a service for which he is not prepared to retain them for an indefinite period. The question of colonial assistance as regards both men and money ought also to be more clearly defined than it has been. Her Majesty's Imperial Government expects from the colony a full and cordial cooperation both in men and money, and unless he is assured of its continuance, the Governor is not prepared to instruct Lieutenant General Cameron to employ Imperial forces. It is therefore necessary that the Governor should be informed whether the colony is ready and willing to give that hearty assistance which the Imperial Government expects. This message is more important than it might initially seem. It actually created a constitutional crisis. Firstly, the Governor was not allowed to talk directly to Parliament. It was Parliament's responsibility to appoint government ministers who communicated between the Governor and Parliament. By going around the government ministers, the Governor was undermining their authority and implying that he lacked confidence in their ability to perform their role. Secondly, the Governor was not allowed to ask for money. Parliament was responsible for taxation and deciding how the government's revenue was to be spent. By asking Parliament to support a resolution to provide full and cordial financial cooperation, he was undermining Parliament's budgetary authority. In fact, Gore-Brown later explains his actions to the Duke of Newcastle by confirming that he had effectively lost confidence in the government and therefore felt it best to communicate directly to Parliament. The leader of the opposition then gave notice of his intention to propose a vote of want of confidence in ministers, and it was generally circulated that if his party came into office they would not hold themselves bound to support the declaration addressed to the Waikatos, that they considered the war an imperial one, and that, although ready to afford assistance, they should not interfere in any way lest they should be called upon to be a part of the expense. Assuming these to be the views of a party not unlikely to succeed to office, and knowing that ministers, having accepted the resolutions, could not assist me, I thought it my duty to send the accompanying messages to the House, where it was received with applause, independently of my responsible advisers. William Fox was the leader of the opposition, and he was not going to let the government ignore the constitutional arrangements that had been threatened by the governor's actions. He asked the ministers why the governor had bypassed them. Stafford's reply was straightforward. Stafford was not going to reply to the honourable member's question now. The motion before the House was that it go into committee to consider His Excellency's message. In other words, Stafford was not going to discuss the implications of the governor's actions. They should all stick to the content of the message. Other MPs sided with Fox. Williamson wanted an explanation. How it was he had submitted to this interference with the privileges of responsible ministers. Carleton was more hostile to the governor. He could only assure the government that if they were only true to themselves on this question, they would receive the hearty support of the honourable members with whom he acted. It remained to be seen whether the executive sided with the House or with His Excellency. Wood seconded Carleton's thoughts. If the House wished to be perfectly enslaved and to place themselves at the feet of the governor and of the honourable gentleman at the ministerial table, they would go into this question without an explanation. But if they wished to preserve their character for independence, they would refuse to consider the question at all till a full and ample explanation had been given. Brandon said the dignity of the House was implicated. Fitzherbert urged that if ministers thus permitted His Excellency to shelve and ignore them, the responsible government, for which they had made so many sacrifices in 1856, was but a delusion and a sham. Stafford eventually got the House to begin considering the content of the message, after he promised that he would answer the questions after they had agreed to discuss the content of the message. His eventual response to these questions was long, but a quick summary was that, yes, the governor had gone completely around the government ministers, and he had not been aware of the message, but he was entirely supportive of it, so if they had been asked, it wouldn't have made any difference. And finally, that it wasn't actually unconstitutional for the governor to do so. The governor was allowed to act independently of the government ministers in regards to defence and Maori affairs, and this message related to both issues. The opposition made it clear that they did not like this answer, but the debate moved on to the content of this message. There were essentially two things the governor was asking for. Firstly, by pointing out that the soldiers currently in the country wouldn't be here for long, he was signalling that he would not be negotiating for long. In fact, he made no effort to negotiate at all. The second point was that he wanted a blank cheque from Parliament, that they would provide him with all the money and soldiers needed for him to win this war. Unsurprisingly, it was the second issue that dominated conversation. The politicians weren't particularly concerned with if a war would happen, but were instead concerned with who had to pay for it. The total expense of the war in Taranaki was not known at this time, partly because the government had offered to pay £5 per imperial soldier in the country per year, but the British government wanted that and an extra £7,000. In 1862, the government estimated that the total cost of the war for New Zealand government was £293,342 paid directly by the government, while they had also spent £130,000 of a £150,000 loan they had taken out, giving a total estimated expense of £423,342. For comparison, the government's revenue for 1861 was £272,000, so the cost of the war was around 150% of the government's total income. It was also estimated that maintaining the militia and imperial troops would cost £80,000 per year, 10 times what the government had budgeted in 1859. All of this is to say that the government couldn't afford to pay for the last war, would probably struggle to maintain its forces during peacetime, and were not keen to pay for the next war. Despite this, a motion to support the governor's speech did pass. It basically gave the governor everything he had asked for, with the only limitation being that the militia would operate under the current militia law, i.e. that they would not be available for offensive campaigns outside their home districts, and the statement ended with a weak objection. At the same time, this House is of the opinion that the employment of the colonists as a militia force, besides interrupting the industrial pursuits of the colony and thereby greatly diminishing its resources, will be far more costly than the employment of a large number of Her Majesty's troops, if these troops could be procured. Effectively, the governor had been given parliamentary approval to invade the Waikato. However, 2 days later this changed dramatically. William Fox, the MP for Rangatike, put forward a motion of no confidence in the government. For those that aren't up with parliamentary procedure, this is a vote to check that the government still has the support of Parliament. If it fails to get over half the MPs' votes, then the government is sacked and MPs work on forming another. This motion of no confidence was closely tied into the war in Taranaki of the previous year, and a potential future war about to start in the Waikato, and the associated expense. Fox argued, in arraigning the ministry before the House, he did not propose to enter upon a general criticism of all their acts for the past 5 years, but should confine himself to such topics as would exhibit their unfitness to hold the reins at the present crisis. That crisis was one unexampled in the history of any colony, and he regarded the present ministry as altogether unequal to it. We stood now in a position precisely analogous to that which we stood little more than a year ago, before the Taranaki War began, and by referring to the character of the government then we might judge what we had to expect from them now. Let the House go back to the first step by which the government involved the colony in responsibility for this war, the fatal Executive Council of the 25th of January 1860, when they advised the governor to draw the sword. What was the result of that advice? It was that the Duke of Newcastle was now in a position to treat it as a settlers' war and charge the colony with its cost. Fox went on to criticise the government's declaration of martial law and the failure to prepare or warn the settlers of the impending conflict. He lays the blame for the early defeats at the feet of the government, and especially criticises them for making peace, at the moment when some success seemed for the first time to be within their reach, when the matured plans of 6 months were about to be brought to a final issue, when a blow might have been struck which might have terminated the war. The ministry rush in and prevent it by offering terms of peace which admit that the government were wrong from the beginning, and by which they now propose that the very investigation, the absence of which caused the war, and which, when proposed in this House a year ago, they scouted on the ground that there had already been too much investigation already. Stafford spoke in great length in response, justifying the minister's advice in every instance, that they could not have known that the declaration of martial law would lead to a war, and so couldn't have armed or evacuated people before it, that their conduct in the early months of the war had been intended to stop the conflict spreading to the Waikato, and that they had not been the cause of the peace, but had taken advantage of the situation they found themselves in to propose a peace they thought could be used to restore the harmony in New Zealand. Unfortunately, nothing is particularly quotable. By his own admission, Stafford was not as good a speaker as Fox. But it was sufficient for J.C. Richmond, the Treasurer's brother, to propose that the motion be adjourned. The House voted in favour of continuing the debate, 27 to 20. Not a great start for the government. John Cracrofts Wilson was the next to speak. He represented Christchurch and had only arrived in New Zealand in 1859. He had previously been a civil servant in the British East India Company and had been given accolades for his conduct in helping to suppress the Indian Mutiny/War of Independence in 1857. Because of this, he claimed great expertise in how to govern Asiatics, as he called them. He asked for 3 regiments of Gurkhas, and he would cut his way through the country from Auckland to Cook Strait, or leave his bones to whiten the earth. Although, as an afterthought, he recommended supporting the government since war was imminent and the settlers needed to present a united front. Alfred Rennell from the Hutt Valley was the next speaker, and he couldn't help taking a dig at Cracroft. The honourable member for Christchurch would pardon him for not attempting to follow him into a country which he did not know, the people of which he had never seen, and whose language he did not understand. Rennell argued that the government had mismanaged the war, but he trusted the vote about to be recorded would relieve those gentlemen and the country from further mismanagement. However, the next vote was to adjourn the debate, which passed this time, and Parliament closed at 11 p.m. The next day the debate resumed, and while other topics were discussed, some objected to the creation of Southland Province and the economic performance of parts of the country, the debate continually came back to the war and how the government had mismanaged it. The fundamental disagreement was the same as the first day, whether it was better to sow unity and maintain the current government when a new war was imminent, or whether it was better to replace it for a more effective government that could better handle the conflict or perhaps even prevent it. Again, the debate went well into the night. Parliament closed at 11:30. On the third day, the debate continued, but finally it came to a vote. 24 supporting the motion of no confidence, 23 against. The government fell by a single vote. This would begin a period of political instability in the central government of New Zealand. Before the next elections in 1865, there would be 5 different governments. But for now, a new government had to be formed, and the House of Representatives was adjourned for a week to enable this to happen. On the 12th of July, Fox announced that he had spoken with the governor and had organised a new government with himself as leader of the House and Attorney General, Dr. Featherston as Colonial Secretary, Rita Wood as Treasurer, Walter Mantell as Native Minister, and John Williamson and Thomas Henderson as Ministers without Portfolio, to use a modern description. Stafford asked for a statement on the native affairs policy of the new government. Walter Mantell, the new Native Minister, had been one of the few to vote against supporting the government in a future military conflict. Fox did not immediately reply, but had a prepared statement ready the next week. He signalled a distinct change in direction. The House would have gathered from what passed on a previous occasion that the government regarded the question of negotiation, preliminary to any act of military operation, as one of vital importance in reference to the present crisis. It was, in fact, he might say, the cardinal point of their policy. He also offered 2 first steps that they would advise the governor to follow. One of the first objects the government ought to have in view in advising His Excellency on the subject will be to clear away what appeared to be misapprehensions in the mind of the Europeans, and come to a clear and distinct understanding as to what the native mind was in relation to this movement, as to what object they had for making their agitation assume this form, so that the government might be enabled to see some way to their suggesting a course by which these misapprehensions referred to might effectually be removed. And referring to the mess of the Native Secretary and Native Land Commissioner, from the times these officers became united, the natives had only looked upon the government as a gigantic land broker, and any endeavours of the government to improve them socially or politically were always tainted with the suspicion that the ultimate object was to obtain their land. The government therefore thought that the suspicion ought to be removed from the native mind, and the first step to be taken to attain that result was that a distinct assurance should be given to the natives that no attempt would be made to purchase their land for the present. In other words, this new government was going to be one that was focused on addressing the concerns of Maori that had led to the formation of the Kingitanga, and would create the space for this conversation by halting land sales, a dramatic reversal of direction for the government. The only problem was that Parliament and the government ministers were not responsible for the relationship between Pākehā and Maori. This was the governor's responsibility, and they could only advise him. The conflict appeared to be brewing between the new government, which was soon being called the Peace Ministry by its opponents, and Gore Brown, who wanted war. But 2 weeks later, an unexpected force intervened: the British government. The British government had been very absent from this history so far. This is because they did not have much to do with how New Zealand was governed. It took roughly 3 months for mail to reach London, and another 3 for the reply to reach New Zealand. So the British generally just sanctioned the conduct of the governor in New Zealand after the fact. However, the Duke of Newcastle had been shocked by what he had been told about the conflict in Taranaki. In particular, it will be recalled that a week before the first ceasefire had been made, 2 letters had been sent to London asking for more troops because there was no end in sight to the conflict. Well, those letters had been received in May, and the Duke of Newcastle took immediate action, writing back to Gore Brown, "Sir, I have perused with much anxiety the intelligence respecting the progress of the native war, which is contained in your dispatches recently received. I cannot but perceive that, in spite of some symptoms of desire on the part of the natives for a restoration of peace, little effect has really been produced hitherto by the military operations at Taranaki. And notwithstanding all the efforts of yourself and your advisers, the disaffection of the Maoris is extending itself to those tribes whose amity, or at least neutrality, has hitherto been hoped for, and is assuming a more organised form and a more definite object. I am far indeed from ascribing this untoward course of events to those who are responsible for the conduct of affairs in New Zealand. On the contrary, I recognise with pleasure the sound and impartial judgment, the integrity, intelligence, and anxiety for the public good, which have characterised your government of the colony for nearly 6 years. The present conjuncture, however, renders it necessary for Her Majesty's government to leave no expedient untried which is calculated to arrest the course of events, now unhappily so unpromising, and, at the same time, to provide for the future difficulties, which there is only too much reason to anticipate, even if the war should happily be soon brought to a conclusion. Having regard, therefore, to the peculiar qualifications and experience of Sir George Grey, now governing the Cape of Good Hope, I have felt that I should be neglecting a chance of averting a more general and disastrous war if I omitted to avail myself of the remarkable authority which will attach to his name and character as Governor of New Zealand." So the language used there is a bit dense, but if you didn't pick up on it, Gore Brown just got sacked as Governor of New Zealand. Of course, he lost his job because he couldn't make peace, but the British didn't know that this was written more than 2 months after the shooting stopped, although they were correct in suggesting that this might prevent a larger war. When this letter arrived in Auckland in August 1861, it meant that Gore Brown had to halt preparations to invade the Waikato. George Grey was expected to arrive in September, and it wouldn't be right to start a conflict just before he arrived to take command. Just like that, the threat of war abated. The Peace Ministry was proposing a new course of action, and they would have a different governor to advise, who might actually accept that advice. But this is where this series ends. I'm intending to do a part 2 looking at the end of 1861 to 1865-ish. Probably at least a year or 2 away though, maybe 3. But keep an eye out for that if you would like to know where this new hope for racial harmony in New Zealand ends up.